I finally went out and bought a ton of physical books in Thai, and this time I'm actually going to read them all. Hey guys, so I have been trying to do more of an input-based approach to learning Thai lately, which, according to all of the research that I've seen, is probably the number one best thing you can do if you want to acquire a language. And I've known this for a long time, so I am always trying to get in reading and listening practice, the two main forms of comprehensible input. But the problem is there's just not a whole lot of good resources for people who are trying to learn Thai. All of the books and TV shows and things out there that I could be reading that are in Thai are designed for people who are native speakers, and honestly that stuff just goes right over my head. It's above my level and I can't understand it. A few months back I found a brand new YouTube channel called Comprehensible Thai, and honestly I've been loving it. And I recommend Comprehensible Thai to anyone that is trying to learn Thai as a beginner. As I'm getting more to an intermediate level in Thai though, I am looking for other forms of input. It's kind of funny, I always hear people talk about the intermediate plateau where your language learning starts to slow down as you get to an intermediate level, but I feel like I've kind of hit the exact opposite thing, where I got intermediate and then all of a sudden it was like a launching point that I could take off from. And I attribute that mainly to the fact that I have abandoned the old-fashioned traditional book learning methods in favor of much more enjoyable comprehensible input methods. So learning is a pleasure now, rather than just something that I used to have to force myself to do back before I knew better. But before I go any further, I just wanted to mention really quickly that I've been getting a lot of comments from people on my channel, and I honestly could not be more thrilled. So many of you starting off on your language learning journey asking, what should I do? Where should I go? How do I get out of the intermediate plateau? And that's awesome. I love all of these questions. I can't always respond to all of them, but I definitely make it a priority to respond to my Patreon patrons. So if you're interested, I actually just started offering a new feature this week, which is unlimited text-based language coaching. So if you've been learning a language for a while and you just need a little bit of guidance about which direction to continue on to, this might be the thing for you. And of course, I'm still gonna absolutely do my best to respond to all comments and questions here on YouTube as well. Anyways, now that I am personally at more of an intermediate level in my target language, Thai, I'm trying to get a lot more into native level content. So not books, TV shows, YouTube videos designed for people who are learning Thai, but Netflix, novels, anything like that is designed for native speakers. It's a lot easier to stay motivated when I'm watching something that is actually designed as entertainment as opposed to something that's designed for language learning. And a big part of the motivation for me to do this was seeing a video by Days of French and Swedish where he said, I believe he read 10 books in Swedish over the course of like a month or something like that. And I just remember thinking, wow, if I were to read 10 books in Thai, which is hard, but if I could just plow through a bunch of books in a month and force myself to do that, I would learn so much more vocabulary. So again, I'm probably more of like a beginner intermediate in Thai right now. I can understand a good deal of content, but I certainly can't just plow through a full-length novel. So the one thing that I decided to do was, instead of reading a whole bunch of traditional novels, I would read graphic novels instead, because the pictures in a graphic novel just do so much work to help you understand the story and not feel lost or like you're missing out on something, even though you might not understand all of the words. They make the input in the book more comprehensible, which of course is the goal. And I started off doing this with an app on my iPad that allowed me to read graphic novels and manga, actually I don't know how to pronounce that word, mangas in Thai, and I did that quite a bit. I made it a goal to read graphic novels or mangas in Thai for an hour a day. I did not achieve that, but that was the goal. So for probably a month or two, I had this goal of reading graphic novels on the iPad every day. And you know, that was fine. I had more or less limited success with that, but it's not the same as holding a physical book in your hand, you know? The other thing I've been trying to get a lot better at is watching Thai shows and movies on Netflix. And I've had a few different strategies that have worked to varying degrees. First, I started just watching Thai shows with English subtitles. And that's not the best approach to language learning, but I figured I can't be language learning all day long. Sometimes I just have to do something just to relax, just to have fun. So in those instances where I just want to watch a show, I can still get a little bit of language learning in by watching a Thai show, even if I'm cheating a little bit by using English subtitles. And that's fine, you know, it's not the best way to learn a language, but then you can't spend all day long doing everything for the most optimal method of learning a language. And while I was going through all of this, I started reading a website called Refold.la, which is created by Matt versus Japan. And he has a pretty interesting explanation of his method for developing lots of vocabulary very quickly in your target language. So he recommends focusing in on one domain, whether it be news broadcasts, fantasy adventures, and I'm sure you could come up with many other very narrow domains of your own, like hip-hop music, basketball, the French Revolution. Well, let's say you focus in on the French Revolution. You're gonna learn the word guillotine, king, nobility, clergy, musket, things like that. And if you focus in on one narrow domain, you're going to see that vocabulary over and over and over until you learn all of it. All right, if you spend half of your time reading about the French Revolution and the other half reading about basketball, you're dividing your attention between two different domains, and you'll still learn vocabulary in those two domains, but at half the speed. So that's why it's a good idea to keep your domains narrowly focused on one specific subject, so you can learn as much about that subject as possible. And then, of course, after you reach a sufficient level in one domain, then you start to spread out and focus in on other areas of interest to you. And so with all of this bouncing around in my mind, I kind of realized, why am I not doing this? This is something that I've actually recommended to a lot of people over the years, but I'm not doing it. And so I said, you know what? I'm a teacher. I'm going to focus in on vocabulary about school. That is the domain that I am focusing on. So I started watching a Netflix movie called Bad Genius, and it's about high schoolers who are trying to cheat the system, get into college without actually doing the studying. It's sort of like a con artist movie where they're coming up with all these dirty little tricks to cheat on exams and stuff like that. And they get caught, and it was a fairly interesting movie. And then I found that there is an entire series based on the movie. Then after a few episodes, I decided that I would start watching one episode entirely with English subtitles and another episode using just the Thai subtitles. So that way I'm able to follow along with the series and stay interested in it, but I'm also interspersing it with periods of more intense active immersion in the language. I also started watching another Netflix show called Girl from Nowhere, and it's about a high school girl with these supernatural powers. She starts going around and kind of like punishing a lot of the bad people in schools, like other students and teachers who are getting away with different crimes and dirty stuff. And so I decided I was going to start watching this TV show entirely in Thai, with no cheats, no help, just gleaning whatever information I could from the show based off of the Thai language, and also just watching what happens in the show. And to be honest, it's not that hard. Even though there's a lot of language that goes over my head, I could probably watch this series on mute and more or less see what's going on. In fact, if you just watch this scene here, even if you can't understand any of what they're saying, I'm sure you can more or less figure out what's going on and why it's bad. Alright, I've been watching these shows for a few weeks now, and then I decided I'm going to follow up with graphic novels in the same domain as these shows. So shows about school kids or teachers or just in the setting, in the context of a school. Alright, mall has a book sale today for 20 baht, which is perfect because that's just like less than $1. So I'm looking through a bunch of graphic novels here and I'm gonna pick a few up for a good price. And it was actually a little bit more difficult than I expected to find books in this domain because a lot of the books that I looked at seemed promising, but they ended up not being graphic novels. They were just regular traditional novels with a sort of anime looking cover. And then I also bought a few other books that seemed to be more along the lines of like fantasy adventure type novels. Definitely not in the domain that I'm working on right now, but I figured this is good motivation for plowing through one domain and then starting on another one that actually is probably going to hold my interest a little bit more than stories about children in schools and stuff like that. Now this book here is the illustrated story of Anne Frank, which I got because I thought it would maybe include some language in here about, homeschooling and maybe math lessons, stuff like that. It's clearly designed for a slightly younger audience, but that's fine. That just means it's not going to have vocabulary that's too complex. And plus, I already am familiar with the story of Anne Frank, so even if I don't understand all the language in the book, the plot line in the story is not going to go over my head, and I will be able to follow along with it. This book is called Garen's Uncanny File, and it's definitely designed more for young adult type readers, so it's going to be a little bit deeper. It actually does start off in a school setting, students discussing their school bake sales, and then pretty quickly as the book progresses, they start fighting demons and stuff like that. And so this one I think is going to be a lot more interesting for an adult reader. And there's a bunch of books in this series, so I think that this one might actually be a good transition from my current domain into the next one. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in private language lessons or coaching with me, go ahead and click on this button here. And until next time, go into the world and learn that language.